The Utah Jazz ended the 2021-22 season with a first-round exit for the third time in the last 4 seasons, and in turn the rumors have been rampant with regards to Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert trades. So let's talk about this Utah Jazz team, their various rumors, and what those possible trades could mean moving forward for Utah. Donovan Mitchell remains the star of this team. He's a perennial all-star. He had another great season in Utah, and despite a poor performance in the playoffs, has shown in the past that he can be that playoff performer. Rudy Gobert had another great defensive season, being one of the best defenders and rebounders in the NBA, but he continues to be a very polarizing player. He has a very wide range of how people evaluate him in the NBA. And part of that is due to that large offensive limitation that he has. Mike Conley, in his third season in Utah, was fine. But at age 34, he's just a fine starting point guard right now. And that's not really what Utah had in mind when they acquired him a couple of years ago. And he's certainly nowhere near being that all-star caliber player he was last season. Bojan Bogdanovic continues to be a very valuable scorer and spacer for this team, arguably the second best scorer, alongside Donovan Mitchell. Royce O'Neal is arguably the only good defender on the team, not named Rudy Gobert in the starting lineup, and he's continued to consistently be a valuable three-point shooter and spacer. Not a great one, but a fine one. Jordan Clarkson has continued to provide some scoring off of the bench, but as is the case with him, he can have great nights, and he can have really bad nights with varying levels of efficiency, and that was no different throughout the 2021-22 season. Rudy Gay was a solid bench piece for Utah, but did not shoot as well this season as he has in the past. Still at a fine rate, but at this point in time in his career with his defense lacking, that lack of efficiency certainly hurt his value and production. Daniel House Jr. was a very good midseason pickup to provide some level of 3-and-D play off of the wing, especially once Joe Ingles was injured, and outside of their centers and Royce O'Neal provided some much-needed quality defense. And Hassan Whiteside was a fine backup center who provided some level of rim protection and rebounding. Obviously is not as good defensively as Rudy Gobert, but provided some level of rim protection so that this defense didn't fall apart completely when Rudy was off the floor. The main point here is that Utah are a good team, but not a great team. Their offense is built off of one great scoring option in Donovan Mitchell, and Donovan Mitchell is great, but he is one singular option, and most teams that have Bojan Bogdanovic as their second best scorer, well, they're not amazing. They can be good, but they're not great. And that's just been a problem in the playoffs as teams can focus in on stopping Donovan Mitchell and ultimately halt their offense. The Utah Jazz defense has a significant problem as well in a similar manner, where everything is built around Rudy Gobert. And that sounds even more daunting and more concerning because defenses do not get built around one player. You need a team to commit to defense to have a good defense. And that rings true in Utah as well. Even with the elite rim protection of Rudy Gobert, which does often get them at least a top half defense in the regular season, if not sometimes even a top 5 defense, once you get to the playoffs, that large amount of dribble penetration that gets allowed by this Utah defense that has poor perimeter defenders doesn't work, and they become an average defense at best. So this is a good team, but they have glaring problems that hold them back, specifically once you get to the playoffs, as they rely on one star on one end and another star on the other end. So let's discuss their options this offseason as regards to trades around Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert, and how these two stars that carry their one end of the floor respectively could end up moving and completely changing the direction of the Utah Jazz. As we get into this discussion, I want to preface it by saying all of these trade talks and rumors around Utah, they're not a result of anything they have done wrong. They have made some very good trades, some very good draft selections, and some very good finds via even undrafted free agents and free agency, to the point where they've gotten to being a good just not great team. And that happens sometimes when you're team building. And so, however, once you get to a point where you have repeat playoff disappointments, where you get to the point where you're just a first round exit, that can lead to some frustrations and might lead to a point in time where you need to change the core of a roster. Hence the discussion we're about to have today. I also want to say that this is not a place for fake trades going through the trade machine. There's a lot of that out there already. Instead, I want to focus on how the roster will likely perform as a result of certain moves and in turn the likely direction of the franchise over the next few years following a certain trade. So let's talk about those options that the Utah Jazz have this summer. A Donovan Mitchell trade results in adding a solid young player and multiple future first-round picks, resulting in a setback in the team's immediate results, but a significant amount of assets to build towards the future. However, it is worth noting that in this situation, Rudy Gobert is not being traded, so a full rebuild is not in play. Utah are still somewhat competitive here, and at least trying to still be somewhat competitive as they maintain a good defense, with Mike Conley, Jordan Clarkson, Bogdanovic, Rudy Gobert all still on the roster alongside the good young player that they add in the Donovan Mitchell trade, alongside a couple of veterans that would likely be in that trade, with a young player being at the RJ Barrett or Tyler Hero type quality. This would be a fine team, but obviously they would be much worse off without Donovan Mitchell, and this offense would have to adjust to being a much more team-centric offense as opposed to a Donovan Mitchell-centric offense. This Jazz team would still not have any cap space, which would not leave free agency as an option as a means to improve the roster, meaning the Jazz's moves would be limited to trades with players currently on the roster, which is very limited as very few players on the roster currently have significant value on the trade market. So this team is obviously much worse, but they should still be in a play-in tournament level. And instead of losing in the first round with some level of hope to get to the second round as they have for the last 4 years, they would likely either lose in the play-in tournament or in the first round without much hope of progressing. But their upside, long-term, would be increased, not significantly, but to a significant enough extent where you could potentially justify the trade of Donovan Mitchell, depending on the return you get, and most significantly, depending on the development of the young player you receive in return. A Rudy Gobert trade, in my opinion, could arguably hurt the team's on-court performance next season just as much, if not more, than an individual trade of Donovan Mitchell. This defense is one of the worst in the NBA without Rudy Gobert. And so if Rudy Gobert is traded away with no defensive-minded center in return, then things could get ugly very quick for this Jazz defense. The Utah Jazz have been at least a top-half defense over the last 4 years, and 2 of those years have seen them in the top 3 in defensive rating. But let's be very, very clear. This team is not filled with an abundance of elite defensive players, as we've previously discussed. This team has one very elite defender, one of the best rim protectors in the NBA, in Rudy Gobert, alongside a few other good defenders and a lot of bad defenders, specifically on the perimeter, meaning Utah funnel everything to Rudy, and if they start funneling everything next year to someone that is not Rudy and is instead Nikola Vucevic, well then that's a problem. Without Rudy Gobert or some other elite tier rim protector, this good defense from Utah completely falls apart. And we've seen that over the course of the past few seasons. When Rudy Gobert has missed time, this Utah defense struggles badly. Side note, even with Rudy Gobert, this defensive system falls off significantly in the playoffs as the dribble penetration becomes detrimental, but that's a whole other story. If Rudy Gobert gets traded for someone like Clint Capella, then Utah can probably still manage to have an okay defense and at least try to stay around the top 15 to 20 in the league. But if someone such as Nikola Vucevic is starting center next season, with Rudy Gobert going to Chicago, then the Jazz may have one of the worst defenses in the league next season. I'm not saying Vucevic to Utah is likely, that's just being used as an example here. This is why I have concerns about how bad Utah will be next season if Rudy Gobert is traded. This team might be built around Donovan Mitchell on offense, but it is built even more so around Rudy Gobert on defense. And Rudy Gobert defensively is better than Donovan Mitchell offensively when compared to the rest of the talent across the league. And there are very few players good enough defensively and from a rim protection standpoint to fill that role to maintain the Jazz's defensive quality in the last few seasons. Hence why I argue that Rudy Gobert is more valuable defensively than Donovan Mitchell is offensively. If the Utah Jazz defense falls off to a bottom 10 or even bottom 5 defense next season without Rudy Gobert, which is very possible, then sure, you might be shaking up the roster by trading up Rudy Gobert. You might be doing something different in Utah to get people excited and to try and give them hope. But that something new could be significantly worse for on-court production and may result in them not even making the playoffs. These two options, where one of only Donovan Mitchell or Rudy Gobert is traded, results in the team being worse, not better, but does not make them bad enough to enter a quick 2 to 3 year rebuild that could give them the chance to acquire elite talent via the draft, to then reach a high upside to become a better team in the West moving forward. It simply puts them back into mediocrity. For that reason, personally, I would not recommend these two options for Utah. If Rudy Gobert and Donovan Mitchell are both traded, then obviously a long-term rebuild is in play in Utah. Mike Conley would likely be traded if anyone had interest in taking on his contract. Bojan Bogdanovic would likely be moved, and the same could be said for Jordan Clarkson and possibly even Royce O'Neal. This obviously leads to a full-scale rebuild, but one that would likely be very good, with a ton of assets, and the Jazz have a relatively good track record with draft selections and would have an absurd amount of assets to begin with. Unfortunately, the Jazz do owe their 2022 pick to the Grizzlies and their 2024 first to OKC, however it is top 10 protected, but also have their 2023 first, and in this scenario, they would likely get their top 10 pick in 2024. But that just scratches the surface. Any Donovan Mitchell trade would see 2 to 4 first-round picks, alongside some pick swaps and a young player with some level of upside, such as RJ Barrett or Tyler Hero, amongst others. Any Rudy Gobert trade would likely see at least 1 first-round pick and some valuable young player or veteran that could be later flipped for assets if desired. Bojan Bogdanovic would likely net a first-round pick. Jordan Clarkson and Royce O'Neal would also have some value to a team, which would possibly net you another first-round pick or 2. So ultimately, the asset pool return from all of their trades could look something like this: 4 to 8 first-round picks, 1 to 2 very good young players, 3 to 5 veterans, and 1 to 3 pick swaps, which to start a rebuild is a ridiculously good amount of assets that could help propel the Jazz back up to the top of the West. Now, obviously, the significant downside here is that the Jazz go from being a playoff regular to completely out of the playoff picture for at least a few seasons. But the upside is the Jazz could have the assets to reach an upside much greater than what they currently are, a regular first-round exit. Personally, I do not expect the Jazz to take up this option. I don't expect the Jazz organization to give up on being a regular playoff team, and especially as a small market, there is inherent value in being a regular playoff team. And so that inherent value is what I believe keeps the Jazz from doing a rebuild and in turn having the chance to raise their ceiling. As much as the trade rumors are heavy and everyone wants to make up mock trades for Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert, there is also a very real possibility where both players are back for next season, Utah trying to make some changes around them and run it back for another season. Now, with no cap space, no great assets to move, and some aging core players around Rudy and Donovan Mitchell, Utah's options to change up the team are very limited, especially having already traded away their 2022 and 2024 first-round picks. And now that lack of upside and that lack of possibility to improve the team was noted as part of the reason why Quinn Snyder left Utah, but that's not to say that the front office is going to feel the same way and want to make changes and not just want to run it back to make the playoffs. Now, on a positive note, everyone outside of Hassan Whiteside and Eric Pascal are under contract for next season, so at least Utah can run it back and make the playoffs again if they want to. However, because those options to shake up their roster are so limited, and because everyone is under contract, if Rudy and Donovan are back, expect the roster to look very, very similar to last year's team, outside of a few depth pieces being added in free agency. It's a boring option for what many would have hyped up as a very exciting offseason in Utah, but is one that is very much a possibility, and ultimately I think the Utah Jazz value continuing to be a playoff regular more than anything else, and so my personal prediction, which is probably not the popular one, is that the Utah Jazz will not trade Donovan Mitchell or Rudy Gobert this offseason. Regardless of what you think Utah should do this offseason, and I'm sure many of us have differing opinions, this offseason is crucial for the future of the Jazz, and any decisions they do or don't make could have a significant impact on the future of Utah Jazz basketball. But that is my thoughts on what's next for the Utah Jazz. Be sure to let me know your thoughts down in the comments below on what is an absolutely pivotal offseason. If you did enjoy the video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Peace.